It was an ordinary Tuesday in September when my life fell apart. The kind of day that should have blended seamlessly with all the others. Coffee at 7:15, commute at 8 on, meetings until lunch, emails all afternoon. Nothing to distinguish it in memory. Nothing to mark it as the day everything changed. But that's how these moments come, isn't it? Not with dramatic thunderstorms or ominous music, but on random weekdays when your biggest concern is whether to pick up Thai or Italian for dinner. I remember checking the time, 3:47 p.m., and deciding I could leave the office early for once. David and I had been like ships passing in the night lately, both of us consumed by our careers. Him with his architecture firm's big downtown project, me with the quarterly marketing campaign for North Star Pharmaceuticals. We'd promised to prioritize date night this week, and I thought surprising him with an early dinner reservation at Luciano's might be just what we needed. As I packed up my laptop, my phone buzzed with a text. "Mrs. Winters, this is Thomas Reed from First Meridian Bank. There's a matter regarding your account that requires immediate attention. Please call me at your earliest convenience." I frowned at the message. It seemed odd, formal yet vague, but not particularly alarming. Probably just some verification issue or a new bank policy. I'd dealt with Thomas before. He was the manager at my local branch, always professional and helpful. I dialed the number as I walked to the parking garage. "First Meridian Bank, Thomas Reed speaking." "Hi, Thomas. This is Caroline Winters. I got your text about my account?" "Mrs. Winters, yes. Thank you for calling back so quickly." His voice had a strange quality to it, overly formal with an undercurrent of discomfort. "I was wondering if you might be able to stop by the branch today. There's a matter we should discuss in person." A flicker of concern rose in my chest. "Is something wrong?" I'd prefer not to discuss the details over the phone. But yes, there is a situation with your joint account that requires your attention. Joint account, the one I shared with David. We each had our own personal accounts, but the joint account was for household expenses, vacations, and our modest but growing retirement savings. We'd been contributing to it faithfully for the 8 years of our marriage. "I can be there in 20 minutes, I said, quickening my pace toward my car. "I'll be here until 6. Please come to my office when you arrive." The drive to the bank was a blur of speculation. Had there been some kind of fraud? A technical error? Maybe an issue with our automatic mortgage payment? Nothing seemed serious enough to warrant Thomas's cryptic tone, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. First Meridian occupied the ground floor of a glass-fronted building on Maple Street. I'd chosen it years ago for convenience. It was halfway between our house and my office. David had simply added his name to my existing account after we got married. The bank was quiet at that hour, just a couple of customers at the teller windows, and a young woman talking to a loan officer in one of the glass-walled meeting rooms. I made my way to Thomas's office at the back, where he was visible through the open door, typing intently at his computer. He looked up as I approached, rising to greet me with a handshake that lasted a beat too long. "Mrs. Winters, thank you for coming in so quickly. Please have a seat." I sat in one of the chairs facing his desk, setting my purse on the floor beside me. "What's going on, Thomas? Your message seemed urgent." He settled back into his chair with a small sigh. "There's no easy way to say this, so I'll be direct. Earlier today, a substantial withdrawal was made from your joint account." "How substantial?" "The withdrawal was for $83,142.15. I felt the blood drain from my face. That was nearly everything in the account. Our emergency fund, vacation savings, and the money we'd been setting aside for a down payment on a vacation cabin in the mountains. Years of careful saving, gone. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "I didn't withdraw that money." "No, you didn't," Thomas said carefully. "The withdrawal was made by the joint account holder, Mr. Winters. in person at our downtown branch. David took out $83,000. That's impossible. He would never. I stopped, the reality beginning to sink in. Did he say why he needed it? Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mrs. Winters, Caroline, I normally wouldn't involve myself in customers' personal matters. Account holders are entitled to access their funds without explaining themselves, especially in a joint account situation with equal access. But, I prompted, sensing he had more to say. But I've known you and your husband for several years. Now, I handled your mortgage application. We've talked about your financial goals. He hesitated. The circumstances of this withdrawal were unusual, concerning even. Which is why I felt obligated to contact you. My heart was pounding now. What circumstances, Thomas? Please just tell me. He took a deep breath. Mr. Winters came in with a woman, not a business associate from what I could gather. They seemed intimately acquainted. He was quite insistent about making the withdrawal in cashier's checks rather than a direct transfer. When my colleague at the downtown branch questioned the large amount, as is protocol, Mr. Winters became agitated and said something about starting over and leaving the past behind. Each word hit me like a physical blow. David, a woman, starting over. The downtown branch manager called me, knowing I was your primary banker, to confirm that everything was in order, Thomas continued. While technically we couldn't refuse the withdrawal from a joint account, something felt wrong. After they left, I took the liberty of calling you. I see, I said, though I didn't see it all. My brain was scrambling to make sense of this information, to find some explanation other than the obvious one staring me in the face. Is there a recording, security footage? Thomas nodded. Yes, all transactions are recorded, but I can't release that to you without a court order or subpoena. He hesitated, then added gently, For what it's worth, I'm truly sorry to be the one telling you this. I nodded mechanically, still processing. David had emptied our account. David had been with another woman. David was starting over. What do I do now? I asked, more to myself than to Thomas. He pushed a folder across the desk toward me. I've prepared some information that might be helpful. Options for protecting your remaining assets, steps to separate your finances if needed, and contact information for our fraud department. Though I should note that, technically, this isn't fraud since Mr. Winters is an authorized account holder. His voice was kind, but his words made everything suddenly terribly real. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was my husband of 8 years taking our money and walking away, with someone else. You said he took cashier's checks, I said, a thought occurring to me. Can they be stopped? Cashier's checks are guaranteed funds, so no, they can't be stopped unless there's proof of fraud or they're lost or stolen. And as I mentioned, in this case, it's not technically fraud, I finished for him, because his name is on the account, too. I'm afraid so. In a joint account, both parties have equal rights to the funds, regardless of who deposited the money originally. I thought of all the deposits I'd made over the years, my yearly bonuses, the inheritance from my grandmother, the extra consulting work I'd taken on specifically to build our savings. Had David been planning this all along? How long had he been seeing this woman? Who was she? As if reading my thoughts, Thomas added, If it helps, the checks were made out to David Winters, not to the woman who accompanied him. It didn't help. Not really. Whether the money was in his name or hers, it was gone, along with my sense of security and apparently my marriage. Is there anything else I should know? I asked, clutching the folder Thomas had given me. Just one thing, he said carefully. You might want to check your other accounts and credit cards. In situations like this, people often take more than you initially discover, I finished, a fresh wave of nausea washing over me. Unfortunately, yes. I stood on shaky legs, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Thank you, Thomas, for calling me and for this information. I know you didn't have to get involved. I've seen too many people blindsided financially by those they trust, he said, rising to walk me out. I couldn't, in good conscience, stay silent. As I walked back to my car, the world had a strange, dreamlike quality. The same buildings, the same streets I'd driven past hundreds of times, but everything felt fundamentally altered. I sat in the driver's seat for several long minutes, not turning the key, just staring at my wedding ring, a simple platinum band that had never left. My finger since the day David had placed it there. Finally, I started the car and pulled out my phone. No messages from David, no missed calls, no explanation for why he'd just burned our life to the ground. I drove home slowly, part of me hoping this was all an elaborate mistake, that David would be there with a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was for a business opportunity. Maybe he'd been coerced somehow. Maybe. But our driveway was empty when I pulled in, and when I entered our house, the craftsman-style home we'd lovingly renovated together over the past 5 years, I knew immediately that something was different. There was a stillness, an absence that went beyond mere emptiness. I walked from room to room, cataloging the missing items, his laptop, the vintage leather duffel bag his father had given him, the framed black and white photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge that had hung in his office. Small things, personal things, deliberately chosen. In our bedroom, his closet door stood open, half the contents gone. On the bed was an envelope with my name written on it in David's architectural block lettering. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Caroline. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I'm sorry for the abruptness, but there's no gentle way to end a marriage. The truth is, I've been unhappy for a long time. We've become different people, heading in different directions. You're dedicated to your career, and I've found someone who shares my vision for the future. I've taken my share of our joint savings. I believe this is fair given my contributions over the years. I've left the house and everything in it to you. It was always more your dream than mine anyway. Please don't try to contact me. My lawyer will be in touch about divorce proceedings. David. I read the note 3 times, each reading bringing fresh waves of shock and disbelief. The clinical tone, the blame shifting, the absolute finality of it. 8 years of marriage dismissed in 5 sentences. I sank onto the edge of the bed, still clutching the letter, when my phone rang. The screen showed my best friend Megan's name. Hello? My voice sounded strange, detached. Caroline? Are you okay? You sound weird. David left me, I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. He emptied our savings account and left me a note. What? Oh my God, I'm coming over right now, don't move. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at nothing, before I heard Megan's key in the front door. She had a spare for emergencies, though neither of us had ever imagined an emergency quite like this. Caroline? She called, her footsteps, quick as she moved through the house. She appeared in the bedroom doorway, her face tight with concern. Oh, honey. She crossed to sit beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. I handed her David's letter wordlessly. As she read, her expression morphed from concern to outrage. That absolute bastard, she breathed. He's found someone who shares his vision? What the hell does that even mean? Apparently it means a woman worth stealing $83,000 for, I said, my voice hollow. Wait, what? He stole money too? I told her about the bank, about Thomas Reed's call and what he'd witnessed at the downtown branch. With each detail, Megan's face grew darker. This is theft, she said firmly. You need to call the police. It's not technically theft, I replied, echoing Thomas's words. His name is on the account too. He had every legal right to take that money. Bullshit. I don't care what the technicalities are. He's been planning this, Caroline. This wasn't some spontaneous decision. He's been seeing this woman, whoever she is, and plotting to take your money and disappear. The cold precision of it hit me then. David must have been calculating this for weeks, maybe months, waiting until we had maximum savings in the account, choosing a Tuesday when I'd be busy with work, taking exactly his share while leaving the house, which had a mortgage to me. "Oh God," I said suddenly, grabbing my phone. "I need to check our credit cards, the other accounts." For the next hour, Megan sat with me as I methodically logged into every financial account I could think of. The damage was both better and worse than I'd feared. He hadn't touched my personal accounts or retirement funds, which were in my name only. But he'd maxed out both of our joint credit cards, another $27,000, and had apparently opened a new card in both our names 3 months earlier, which was also at its $15,000 limit. How did I not know about this card? I asked, staring at the statement showing charges at hotels, restaurants, and jewelry stores I'd never visited. Because he had the statement sent electronically and probably used his personal email, Megan said grimly. Caroline, this is beyond a shitty husband leaving. This is financial fraud. I should have seen it coming, I said, a fresh wave of humiliation washing over me. All those late nights he claimed to be working, the business trips that seemed to multiply. He's been living a double life, and I was too busy with my own career to notice. Stop that right now, Megan said firmly. This is not your fault. David is the one who cheated. David is the one who stole. David is the one who lied. You are the victim here, not the perpetrator. Her words were exactly what I needed to hear, but they couldn't erase the crushing weight of reality. In the space of 3 hours, I'd lost my husband, my savings, and any sense of security or trust I'd built over the years. What do I do now? I asked, echoing the question I'd posed to Thomas Reed earlier. Megan squeezed my hand. First, we document everything. The letter, the bank withdrawals, the credit card statements, all of it. Then tomorrow we find you the best divorce attorney in the city. And tonight? She gave me a sad smile. Tonight we order takeout, open a bottle of wine, and I stay over so you're not alone. One step at a time, okay? I nodded, grateful beyond words for her presence and practical approach. As she went to find the takeout menus, I sat surrounded by bank statements and credit card bills, the wreckage of my marriage laid out in cold financial terms. David Winters, the man who'd promised to love and cherish me until death, had just cleaned out our joint accounts, maxed out our credit cards, and walked away without a backward glance. For another woman. The shock was beginning to give way to something else now, a slow burning anger that started in my chest and radiated outward. How dare he? How dare he throw away 8 years like they meant nothing? How dare he steal my financial security and then blame me for being dedicated to my career? By the time Megan returned with the Thai food menu, I'd moved from stunned victim to something else entirely. I'm going to fight, I said as she sat back down beside me. For every penny he took, for every lie he told. This isn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. Megan smiled, a fierce gleam in her eye. Now that's the Caroline I know. As we ordered dinner and opened wine, I had no way of knowing just how complicated that fight would become, or how it would ultimately transform not just my finances, but every aspect of my life. Chapter 2. The Aftermath. The first week after. David left was a blur of practical matters and emotional earthquakes. Megan stayed with me for 3 nights, sleeping in the guest room and making sure I ate something besides wine and crackers. She also helped me inventory everything David had taken, which turned out to be surprisingly little beyond his personal items, as if he were traveling light for his new life. On Wednesday morning, we met with Elaine Baxter, a divorce attorney. Megan's cousin had used the previous year. Her office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, with original hardwood floors and modern glass desks. an appropriate blend of traditional and progressive, much like Elaine herself. She was in her 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of self-possession that comes from decades of watching people at their worst. She listened without interruption as I explained the situation, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "So, to summarize," she said when I'd finished, "your husband withdrew nearly all your joint savings, maxed out shared credit cards, opened a new card fraudulently, left you with a mortgage, and informed you of the end of your marriage via a note, all while apparently involved with another woman." "That's correct," I said, the stark recitation making me feel slightly nauseated, all over again. "And you have no idea who this woman is?" I shook my head. "The bank manager just said they seemed intimately acquainted. David didn't mention her name in his letter, just that she shares his vision." Elaine made another note. "Do you have the letter with you?" I removed it from my purse and handed it over. She read it quickly, her expression revealing nothing. "This will be helpful," she said, sliding it into a folder. "Now, what do you know about your husband's current whereabouts?" "Nothing. He hasn't contacted me since leaving. His cell phone goes straight to voicemail. His colleagues at the architecture firm claim they don't know anything, though one of them sounded suspicious when I called." "The firm is Winters and Associates, correct? The one he co-owns with his father?" "Yes, though Marshall, his father, is semi-retired now. David runs most of the day-to-day operations. Family businesses complicate things," Elaine noted. "We'll need to look at how the business assets intersect with marital assets." She tapped her pen thoughtfully. "What about social media? Has he been active?" "His profiles are all still up, but there haven't been any new posts since last week. I've been checking." "Caroline had the presence of mind to take screenshots of everything," Megan added. "Bank statements, credit card statements, social media profiles, everything we could think of." Elaine nodded approvingly. "That's excellent. Documentation is crucial in these cases. Cases like mine must be common," I said. "Husband leaves wife for another woman, tale as old as time." "The circumstances are never quite the same," Elaine replied. "And I have to say, the financial aspects of your situation are particularly concerning. Taking marital assets is one thing. And yes, as your banker explained, technically legal with a joint account. But opening a credit card in both names without your knowledge? That crosses a line." "Can we use that?" Megan asked eagerly. "To go after him?" "Potentially," Elaine said, turning to me. "Caroline, I need to ask, what do you want from this divorce?" The question caught me off guard. What did I want? I hadn't even begun to think beyond the immediate shock and betrayal. I want what's fair," I said finally. "I want back what he took. I want him to pay his share of the debt he created. I want justice," Megan supplied. "Yes," I agreed. "Justice." Elaine studied me for a moment. "Justice in divorce proceedings is often messy and incomplete, but fairness, that we can fight for." She closed her notebook. "Here's what we'll do. First, I'll file for divorce citing abandonment and financial misconduct. We'll request an emergency hearing regarding the distribution of assets and debts." "How quickly can we do that?" I asked. "I can have the paperwork filed by the end of the week, but we need to serve your husband, which means we need to find him. Do you have any ideas where he might have gone?" I shook my head. "David's an only child. His mother died years ago. His father lives in Florida now. Beyond work colleagues, he doesn't have many close friends." "What about the woman's identity? Any colleagues who seemed too friendly? Friends who became suddenly scarce? Social media connections that seemed odd?" I thought about it, trying to recall any signs I might have missed. "There's his assistant, Veronica. She's been working with him for about a year. Young, ambitious. I've only met her a few times, but she always seemed I don't know, overly familiar? But that could just be her personality. It's worth looking into, Elaine said. Anyone else? There's a client he's been spending a lot of time with recently. Sophia Reeves. She's developing some luxury condos. Downtown, David's firm is handling the design. Reeves Development? Elaine asked, her eyebrows rising slightly. Owned by Theodore Reeves? His daughter, I think. She took over some of the company's projects last year. Elaine made a note. The Reeves family is well connected in this city. If there's a connection there, we need to tread carefully. She closed her notebook. I'll have my investigator look into both possibilities. In the meantime, I need you to do something that will be difficult. What's that? Nothing. Don't contact David. Don't post on social media. Don't tell friends or colleagues what's happening. Beyond those you absolutely trust. She glanced at Megan. The element of surprise is our best advantage right now. If David doesn't know you're building a case, he might get careless. The idea of doing nothing when every cell in my body was screaming for action was excruciating. But I understood the strategy. What about my job? I asked. People will notice when I change my name back and stop wearing my wedding ring. You can say you're separated and leave it at that. No details, no accusations. Remember that anything you say publicly could get back to David. I nodded, though the thought of maintaining such tight control over my emotions seemed nearly impossible. As we left Elaine's office, Megan linked her arm through mine. You're doing the right thing, Caroline. David thinks he's gotten away clean, but he has no idea what's coming. I hope you're right, I said, squinting in the bright September sunshine. Because right now, it feels like he's winning. First rule of war, Megan said firmly. Let the enemy think they're winning until it's too late for them to change course. War. The word resonated uncomfortably. Was that what my marriage had become? A battlefield with casualties and strategies. It seemed so far from the partnership I thought we'd built. That evening, alone in the house for the first time since David left, I found myself wandering from room to room, seeing everything with new eyes. The bathroom counter with only my products lined up neatly. The closet half empty. The kitchen where we'd cooked together countless times, now oddly spacious with just my things. In David's home office, I stood in the doorway, reluctant, to enter what had always been his space. He'd taken his computer and some files, but the room was otherwise intact. Bookshelves lined with architectural volumes, drafting table angled toward the window to catch the best light, abstract prints on the walls. Something compelled me to step inside to look more closely at what he'd chosen to leave behind. On the bookshelf were family photos. Our wedding, a vacation in Maine, his college graduation with his parents. Had they meant so little that he could walk away without them? Or had he been in such a hurry that he'd forgotten? I opened the desk drawers, not sure what I was looking for. Most contained the expected office supplies: pens, paper clips, sticky notes. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of file folders, I found a small velvet box. My heart raced as I opened it. Inside was a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a teardrop emerald pendant. Expensive, elegant, and definitely not mine. I'd never seen it before. David had never given it to me, which meant... My hands shook as I closed the box and placed it back exactly where I'd found it. This was evidence, proof that there had been someone else while we were still together. I took a photo of the box in the drawer, then several more of the office, documenting everything just as Megan and I had done with the financial records. As I continued searching, I found other disturbing items. A receipt for dinner at Le Cirque, an exclusive restaurant across town that David and I had never visited together. A ticket stub for a concert on a night he'd claimed to be working late. Small pieces of a double life that I'd been completely blind to. I gathered everything, placing it in a large envelope to give to Elaine. Physical evidence to support the financial trail. David might have taken our money, but he'd left behind the breadcrumbs of his deception. That night, lying in my bed, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how well I'd really known my husband. Had he always been capable of such calculation and cruelty? Or had something changed him? Had I changed him somehow? My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from a number I didn't recognize. I heard about David. I'm so sorry. If you need anything, please let me know. Rachel T. Rachel Tanner, David's colleague from the firm, a junior architect who'd joined about 2 years ago. We'd met at company functions, but I wouldn't have considered us close enough for this kind of outreach. I hesitated, remembering Elaine's advice about keeping quiet. But Rachel had initiated the contact, not me, and she might have information. Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate that. It's been a shock. Her response came quickly. I can imagine. Just know not everyone at the firm supports how he's handling things. This was interesting, so there was internal knowledge, perhaps even discord, about David's actions. That means a lot to me. Has he been in the office? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again as she typed. Not since last week. Marshall has been making excuses, but rumor has it he's at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel downtown. The Grand Metropolitan, one of the most expensive hotels in the city. Perfect for someone who suddenly had $83,000 to spend. Thanks for letting me know. I'd appreciate if you kept this conversation between us. Of course. Take care of yourself, Caroline. I saved the conversation, then forwarded it to both Megan and Elaine. This was exactly the kind of information we needed. A possible location for David, and confirmation that his workplace was aware of the situation, despite claiming ignorance when I'd called. For the first time since that terrible Tuesday, I felt a glimmer of hope. David might have had a head start, but I was catching up. And with Elaine's help, I would make sure he didn't get to simply walk away from the wreckage he'd created. Sleep came easier that night, though my dreams were troubled, chasing David through endless hotel corridors, never quite catching him, while a faceless woman laughed from around each corner. The next morning, I awoke to an email from Elaine. Caroline. Thank you for the information about the Grand Metropolitan. My investigator will look into it immediately. I've also filed the initial divorce papers, as discussed. We should have a court date for the emergency hearing within 2 weeks. In the meantime, I want you to think about securing your financial future. You mentioned your job at North Star Pharmaceuticals. Are there any upcoming bonuses or commissions that David might be aware of? We should ensure those are protected. Also, please gather documentation of your contributions to the joint account over the past 24 months. Bank records showing deposits from your paycheck will be particularly useful. Stay strong. We're making progress. Elaine. I spent Thursday gathering the requested financial records, grateful for the practical tasks that kept my mind occupied. North Star's HR department was surprisingly helpful when I explained I needed documentation of my direct deposits for personal financial planning. Within hours, I had statements showing every cent I'd contributed to our joint account since its creation. The numbers told a clear story. Over the past 2 years, I'd deposited significantly more than David had. Approximately 60% of the total funds. If we were dividing things fairly, as he'd claimed in his letter, he'd significantly overshot his share. I forwarded everything to Elaine, along with a note about my upcoming quarterly bonus due in October. It wasn't huge, about $8,000 after taxes, but it was money David might try to claim as marital assets if the divorce wasn't finalized by then. On Friday morning, I returned to work, having taken the previous 3 days as personal time. My team was understanding if a bit curious about my subdued demeanor. I attributed it to a family emergency, offering no details, and they respectfully avoided pressing for more information. Focusing on marketing strategies and campaign metrics was strangely comforting. A familiar world where I knew the rules and expectations. For 8 hours, I could immerse myself in work and pretend my personal life hadn't imploded. That illusion shattered when I returned home to find a sleek black Mercedes parked in my driveway. Marshall Winters, David's father, was sitting on my front porch swing. Chapter 3. Unexpected Allies. I considered driving past my own house, not yet ready to face any member of the Winters family. But Marshall had already seen me, rising from the porch swing with the athletic grace that belied his 70 years. "Caroline," he called, his deep voice carrying across the front yard. "I was hoping you'd be home soon." I parked reluctantly and grabbed my purse, mentally reviewing Elaine's advice about not discussing the situation with anyone connected to David. But this was his father, my father-in-law for 8 years. I couldn't just ignore him. "Marshall," I acknowledged as I approached the porch. "This is a surprise." He was impeccably dressed as always. Tan slacks, blue button-down with the sleeves rolled to reveal tanned forearms, Italian loafers. Silver hair still thick, blue eyes still sharp. David would look just like him in 30 years. "I'm sure it is," he said, his expression grave. "May I come in? I think we need to talk." Every instinct warned against this conversation, but curiosity won out. I unlocked the front door and led him into the living room, gesturing toward an armchair while I took the couch. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "No, thank you," he said, sitting with perfect posture, hands resting on his knees. "Caroline, I want you to know that I had no knowledge of David's plans. His actions have come as much of a shock to me as they have to you." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Really?" "Because I was told he hasn't been to work all week and you've been making excuses for him." Marshall had the grace to look embarrassed. "I've been trying to understand the situation before making any public statements. The firm's reputation is more important than honesty." I finished for him. "More important than the fact that your son emptied our savings account and disappeared. With another woman?" "Of course not," he said quickly. "That's why I'm here. What David has done is unconscionable. I wanted to tell you personally that I do not condone his behavior, nor will I support him in this." This was not what I'd expected. I'd assumed Marshall would defend his son, perhaps try to justify his actions or pressure me into a quick, quiet divorce. "You're taking my side?" I asked, unable to keep the surprise from my voice. "I'm taking the side of decency and honor," he replied. "The Winters name has always stood for both. What David has done violates everything I taught him about being a man of integrity." There was genuine anger in his voice, and something else. Disappointment, perhaps even shame. "Have you spoken to him?" I asked. Marshall nodded. "Yesterday. He called from a blocked number, wanting access to some of the firm's client files. I asked him about you, about the money. He was evasive, defensive, said it was complicated and he'd explain everything later." "Did he mention where he's staying, or who he's with?" "No to both, but Caroline." He hesitated. "The woman you mentioned, Sophia Reeves? She's pulled her project from our firm, effective immediately, no explanation given. It's a significant loss, nearly $3 million in design fees." My mind raced. Sophia Reeves, the developer client, was she the mystery woman? Had she and David arranged not just to be together, but to start some new venture with my money? "I'm sorry about the firm's loss," I said carefully, "but I'm more concerned about my own losses at the moment." "As you should be," Marshall agreed. "Which brings me to the other reason for my visit. I want to help you." I eyed him warily. "Help me how?" He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a checkbook. "I'd like to replace the money David took from your joint account. Consider it a loan, if you wish, to be repaid from whatever settlement you reach with him." But I don't want you to suffer financially because of my son's actions. I stared at him, stunned by the offer. Marshall, I appreciate the gesture, but I can't accept that. Why not? He asked simply. Because, I searched for the right words. Because it's not your responsibility to fix what David broke, and because taking money from you would complicate an already messy situation. Marshall nodded slowly, replacing the checkbook in his pocket. I understand your reluctance, but my offer stands if you change your mind. He leaned forward slightly. Caroline, I've always respected you, your intelligence, your work ethic, your integrity. David was lucky to have you, and he's a fool for throwing it all away. His words touched me unexpectedly, bringing a lump to my throat. In our 8 years of marriage, Marshall had always been cordial, but somewhat distant. The successful patriarch who'd built Winters and Associates from nothing, who'd pushed his son to follow in his footsteps. This show of support was unprecedented. Thank you, I managed. That means a lot, especially right now. I have another proposition, he continued. One you might find more acceptable than the money. What's that? Information. I have access to resources that might help you understand what David is up to and who he's involved with. Now we were getting somewhere. What kind of resources? The firm keeps detailed records of all client meetings, expenses, communications. If David has been conducting personal business on company time, there would be a trail. And as the majority owner, I have every right to review those records. I thought about Elaine's strategy, the importance of finding David, of documenting his relationship with whoever had accompanied him to the bank. Would you be willing to share those records with my attorney? I asked cautiously. I would. He reached into his other pocket and produced a business card. Elaine Baxter. Good choice. Tough, but fair. I've already left her a message, but I wanted to speak with you directly first. I took the card, noting that it was indeed Elaine's. Why are you doing this, Marshall? He's your son. Marshall's expression darkened. Because 30 years ago, I made similar mistakes. I nearly destroyed my marriage to David's mother with an affair. Helen forgave me, gave me a second chance I probably didn't deserve. We rebuilt our life together, and those were the best years of my life until she passed. He shook his head. I tried to teach David that lesson, that integrity and loyalty matter more than momentary desires. Clearly, I failed. The personal revelation surprised me. David had never mentioned his father's infidelity, though it explained certain tensions I'd observed in family gatherings over the years. I'm sorry, I said, not sure what else to offer. Don't be. I earned every bit of pain that came with it. Marshall stood, signaling the end of our conversation. I'll be in touch with Elaine about those records. And Caroline. David doesn't know I'm here. I'd prefer to keep it that way for now. I nodded. Of course. At the door, he paused. One more thing. David has a key to this house. You might want to change the locks. The suggestion sent a chill through me. I hadn't even thought about the practical aspects of security. What if David returned while I was sleeping or away at work? I'll take care of it today, I promised. After Marshall left, I called Megan immediately to fill her in on the unexpected visit. His own father is turning against him? She marveled. This is huge, Caroline! It feels strange, I admitted. Like I'm being pulled into some Winters family drama that predates my relationship with David. Who cares about the family drama? Marshall has access to information that could help your case, and he offered you money, which I declined. Of course you did, because you're Caroline Winters, woman of principle. But the information? That's gold. She was right, of course. Whatever Marshall's personal motivations, his access to the firm's records could provide valuable evidence for the divorce proceedings. I called a locksmith before dinner, and by 7 p.m., all the exterior doors had new locks and keys. The technician also installed a simple security system with door and window sensors, an extra precaution that helped me sleep more soundly that night. Saturday morning brought a text from Elaine. Met with Marshall W. yesterday. Very informative. Call me on Monday to discuss. I tried not to read too much into the cryptic message, but it was difficult not to speculate. What had Marshall revealed? Had he found evidence of David's affair in the company records? Proof of financial misconduct? To distract myself, I tackled a project I'd been avoiding, sorting through the bedroom closet, removing David's remaining clothes to make room for my own. It was a symbolic gesture as much as a practical one, a way of reclaiming space, both physical and emotional. As I worked, I realized how little I knew about my husband's daily life. His suits and casual clothes revealed nothing particularly interesting. His half of the closet was organized, but not obsessively so. There were no hidden pockets with secret notes, no mysterious keys or receipts, just the ordinary belongings of a man who had walked out on his marriage. I was about to close the now half-empty closet when my gaze fell on the high shelf where we kept rarely used items. David's old college backpack was pushed against the wall, partially hidden by winter blankets. On impulse, I pulled it down. The backpack was dusty, clearly untouched for years. Inside were exactly what you'd expect: old textbooks, notebooks filled with architectural sketches, a few dried-out pens. But wedged into a side pocket was a small notebook I didn't recognize. It was a simple black moleskin, its pages filled with David's distinctive handwriting. Most entries were mundane: appointments, reminders, brief notes about projects. But scattered throughout were entries marked with a small star symbol. SR, Oceanic Grill, 7:30. Discuss Harborview proposal with SR, Hotel Bar. SR's birthday, Tiffany necklace. The entries dated back nearly a year, becoming more frequent in recent months. SR Sophia Reeves? The necklace entry was from July, around the time I'd noticed a significant withdrawal from our joint account, which David had explained as a gift for his assistant's wedding. I photographed every page with the star symbol, then returned the notebook exactly where I'd found it. This could be the evidence we needed to connect David to Sophia, and to prove that their relationship predated his disappearance with our money. By the time Monday arrived, I'd compiled a substantial file of potential evidence: the notebook entries, the items from David's office, the financial records showing suspicious withdrawals that now made sense in context. I brought everything to my lunch meeting with Elaine, eager to hear what she'd learned from Marshall. We met at a small cafe several blocks from her office, choosing a corner table that afforded privacy. Marshall Winters provided some very interesting information, Elaine said once we'd ordered. It seems your husband has been conducting personal business on company time for quite a while. Sophia Reeves? I guessed. Elaine's eyebrows rose. You've been doing some investigating of your own? I showed her the photographs of the notebook entries. Found this in our closet over the weekend. SR appears repeatedly over the past year. And look at this July entry about a Tiffany necklace. Which corresponds with this, Elaine said, sliding a photocopy across the table. It was an expense report, form from Winters & Associates, showing a $3,200 charge to the company credit card at Tiffany & Co., listed as Client Appreciation Gift, Reeves Development. He used company money to buy her jewelry, I said, the betrayal somehow even sharper now that it was confirmed. It gets better, Elaine continued. Marshall provided records of all meetings between David and Sophia Reeves over the past 18 months. What started as legitimate business appointments gradually became more frequent, longer, and increasingly personal in nature. How personal? Dinner meetings that lasted until midnight, weekend site visits with hotel charges in locations, nowhere near their actual projects. And most recently, a 3-day conference in Chicago that neither of them actually attended, according to the conference organizers Marshall contacted. Each revelation was like a fresh cut, but also oddly validating. I hadn't been crazy or paranoid. The signs had been there all along. I just hadn't been looking for them. "There's more," Elaine said, her expression turning serious. Marshall also provided information about a new architectural venture David has been planning. Apparently, he and Sophia Reeves have incorporated a new firm, Reeves and Winters Design Group. The paperwork was filed 2 months ago. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. 2 months ago, everything seemed normal. We were talking about trying for a baby. Elaine reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly, a rare gesture of personal comfort from the professional attorney. "I'm sorry, Caroline. I know this is difficult to hear. But from a legal standpoint, this information is extremely helpful. It establishes a clear timeline of David's deception and demonstrates premeditation in his financial actions." I nodded, forcing myself to focus on the practical implications rather than the emotional wound. "What does this mean for the emergency hearing?" "It means we have a much stronger case for securing temporary support and freezing any remaining marital assets. It also gives us leverage for the eventual settlement." Elaine gathered her papers. "The hearing is scheduled for next Thursday. Given this new evidence, I'm confident we'll get a favorable ruling." "And what about finding David? Serving him? With the divorce papers?" Marshall provided the address of a condominium in Sophia Reeves's name. "My investigator confirmed that David has been staying there. We'll serve the papers tomorrow." I pictured David's face when he received the legal documents, the shock, perhaps anger, at discovering his carefully constructed escape plan was unraveling. Would he feel remorse, panic, or just irritation at the inconvenience? "What happens after he's served?" I asked. "He'll have 30 days to respond. Given what we know, he'll likely hire an attorney immediately." Marshall mentioned that David has already resigned from the firm, so he's burning bridges left and right. "Including with his own father," I mused. "That seems extreme, even for David." Elaine nodded thoughtfully. "People in the midst of these kinds of life upheavals often make irrational decisions. The combination of a new relationship, financial misconduct, and the adrenaline of starting over can create a sort of temporary insanity." "You sound like you've seen this before." "Many times, and it rarely ends well for the person who blew up their life." She checked her watch. "I need to get back to the office, but I wanted you to know about these developments in person. Keep gathering evidence on your end, but remember, no direct contact with David. Everything goes through me now." As we parted ways, I felt a strange mix of emotions: vindication at having concrete evidence of David's betrayal, but also a deepening sense of loss. Not just of my husband, but of the narrative of our marriage. Every memory now required re-examination. Had anything been real? Or had I been a convenient placeholder until Sophia Reeves came along? I returned to work that afternoon distracted, unable to focus on the marketing campaign I'd been developing. My team noticed, exchanging concerned glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Finally, my assistant, Jen, closed my office door and approached my desk. "Caroline, I've worked with you for 3 years, and I've never seen you like this. What's going on? And don't say nothing, because we both know that's not true." I hesitated, remembering Elaine's advice about discretion. But Jen wasn't just a colleague. She was someone I trusted, someone who had supported me through other difficult times. "My marriage is over," I said simply. "David left. It's complicated and messy, and I'm trying to keep it from affecting my work." Jen's expression softened. "I figured it was something like that when you stopped wearing your ring last week." She sat in the chair opposite my desk. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Actually, yes," I decided. "I need to clear my schedule for next Thursday morning. I have a court hearing." "Consider it done," she said without hesitation. "And Caroline, your work hasn't suffered. No one would know anything was wrong if they weren't paying close attention." Her words were reassuring. At least professionally, I was maintaining the facade of normalcy. It was something to hold on to while everything else crumbled around me. That evening, I forced myself to go grocery shopping, a mundane task that suddenly felt different when buying for one instead of two. As I stood in the produce section, debating between a full bag of apples or just a couple, my phone rang with an unknown number. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Caroline? It's Rachel Tanner from Winters and Associates." The junior architect who had texted me about David's whereabouts. "Hi, Rachel. Is everything okay?" "I'm not sure," she said, her voice low as if she was trying not to be overheard. "I thought you should know. David came to the office today to clear out his things. He was with Sophia Reeves." My heart rate quickened. Did he say anything about me? Not directly. But he and Marshall had a huge argument in Marshall's office. Everyone could hear them shouting. Something about betrayal and family loyalty. Did you hear anything specific? Marshall called him a thief. Said he'd stolen from his wife and the company? David said something about everyone choosing your side and how he didn't need any of us anymore. So Marshall had confronted him directly. That explained why David had suddenly appeared at the office after a week's absence. He must have realized his father was gathering evidence against him. "Thanks for letting me know, Rachel. I appreciate you looking out for me." "There's one more thing," she added. After David left, Marshall called an all-staff meeting. He announced that David is no longer associated with the firm, effective immediately. And he said that anyone with information about financial irregularities involving David should come forward immediately. This was a significant escalation. Marshall wasn't just supporting me privately. He was publicly disavowing his son's actions and potentially building a case against him. How did people react? I asked. Shocked, mostly. David was being groomed to take over the company. No one expected this kind of public break. She paused. "I should go. Just wanted you to be prepared in case David tries to contact you. He seemed unstable." After thanking her again, I immediately called Elaine to relay the new information. She agreed that David might attempt to reach out now that he was feeling cornered. "If he calls or shows up, do not engage," she warned. "Record any messages, document any interactions, but do not respond directly. This is crucial, Caroline." "I understand," I assured her. "But what if he tries to take more assets or access accounts I don't know about? I'll file for an emergency restraining order first thing tomorrow. It won't just be about physical distance. It will include financial protections as well." That night, I double-checked all the locks and set the new security system before going to bed. Despite these precautions, I slept fitfully, half expecting to hear David's key in the old lock or his voice calling my name. Morning came without incident, but the day brought a new complication. As I was leaving for work, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street, a dark sedan with tinted windows. The same car was there when I returned in the evening. While it might have been coincidence, my instincts suggested otherwise. I called Megan, who came over immediately to investigate. She approached the car directly, in her characteristically fearless way, but it pulled away as she neared, driving quickly down the street. "Definitely suspicious," she declared when she returned to my house. "Could be a private investigator. David might be trying to gather information for his side of the case." The thought of being watched made my skin crawl. I reported the incident to Elaine, who added it to her filing for the restraining order. By Wednesday, the court had granted the temporary restraining order. David was legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, or my workplace. He was also barred from accessing any joint financial accounts or creating new debt in my name. That same day, Elaine confirmed that David had been successfully served with the divorce papers. According to the process server, he had accepted them silently, his face unreadable. Sophia Reeves had been present in the condo, but had remained in another room during the interaction. The pieces were falling into place. I had legal protections, evidence of David's misconduct, and an experienced attorney fighting for my interests. Yet, despite these reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still coming, that David wouldn't simply accept defeat and move on. I was right to be concerned. At 11:42 p.m. on Wednesday night, my phone lit up with David's name. No call, just a text message. "We need to talk. This doesn't have to be so complicated. Meet me tomorrow, 8 a.m. at Riverside Park. Come alone, no lawyers, last chance to resolve this amicably." I stared at the message, tempted for a brief moment to respond. But Elaine's warnings echoed in my mind. Instead of replying, I took a screenshot and forwarded it to her with a brief note. "Just received this from David. Not responding as instructed." Her reply came within minutes, despite the late hour. "Good. This actually helps our case for tomorrow's hearing. He's been served with the restraining order and is already violating it by contacting you. Get some rest. Tomorrow is important." Sleep didn't come easily, but I managed a few hours before my alarm jolted me awake at 6 a.m. I dressed carefully, for court in a conservative navy suit, applied minimal makeup, and pulled my hair back in a simple knot. Presentation mattered in these situations. I needed to appear composed, rational, and credible. Megan picked me up at 7:30, insisting on driving me to the courthouse, in case David tries anything. Her protectiveness was touching, if slightly dramatic. But given the mysterious car that had been watching my house and David's text message, perhaps drama was warranted. The family court was housed in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel with an atmosphere of efficient solemnity. Elaine met us in the lobby, immaculately dressed in a charcoal pantsuit, briefcase in hand. "You look perfect," she approved, giving me a quick once-over. "Professional but not cold, composed but not unfeeling. The judge for our hearing is Eleanor Hammond. Fair but traditional. First impressions matter with her." "Will David be here?" I asked, scanning the busy lobby nervously. "Most likely. His attorney filed an appearance yesterday, Clark Davidson. Aggressive, somewhat theatrical, but not particularly detail-oriented. A good match for our purposes." We took the elevator to the third floor and made our way to courtroom 307. Outside the double doors, Elaine paused to give me final instructions. "Let me do most of the talking. Answer questions directly and honestly, but don't volunteer information unless asked. If David or his attorney says something provocative, don't react visibly. Judge Hammond watches reactions closely." I nodded, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. "I'm ready." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with just a few rows of wooden benches facing the judge's bench. A handful of people, other petitioners and their attorneys presumably, sat scattered throughout the room, waiting for their cases to be called. And there, in the front row on the opposite side, sat David. He was wearing his best suit, charcoal gray, impeccably tailored, and had gotten a fresh haircut. He looked exactly like the successful architect and businessman he'd always been, not like a man who had emptied our savings account and run off with another woman. Beside him sat an older man with silver hair and an expensive watch gleaming at his wrist. Clark Davidson, I presumed. David's eyes met mine as we entered, his expression unreadable. I kept my face carefully neutral, just as Elaine had instructed. Though my heart was racing so loudly, I was sure everyone could hear it. We took our seats on the opposite side of the aisle. Megan squeezed my hand once before sitting in the row behind us, giving me and Elaine space to confer privately. "Don't look at him," Elaine murmured. "Focus on me or on the judge when she enters." I nodded, keeping my gaze fixed on the empty judge's bench. But I could feel David watching me, his stare like a physical touch on my skin. At precisely 9 a.m., a bailiff entered. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Hammond." Judge Hammond was a striking woman in her 60s, with short silver hair and piercing dark eyes behind frameless glasses. She moved with brisk efficiency, taking her seat, and immediately reviewing the documents before her. "We have several emergency hearings this morning," she announced. We'll begin with Winters vs. Winters. Case number 2023 DR 4729. Elaine and I approached the petitioner's table on one side of the courtroom, while David and his attorney took their places on the other. Your Honor, Elaine Baxter, representing Caroline Winters, the petitioner, Elaine began. Clark Davidson for David Winters, respondent, the silver-haired man countered. Judge Hammond nodded, then addressed me directly. Mrs. Winters, you filed for an emergency hearing regarding marital assets and temporary support, is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, I responded, my voice steadier than I expected. You allege that Mr. Winters emptied your joint savings account of approximately $83,000 and incurred additional credit card debt of $42,000 before abandoning the marital home. Is that an accurate summary? Yes, Your Honor. She turned to David. Mr. Winters, do you dispute these allegations? David leaned toward his microphone. I dispute the characterization, Your Honor. I did withdraw funds from our joint account, but these were marital assets to which I was legally entitled. As for the credit card charges, those were legitimate expenses related to my architectural business. His voice, so familiar yet somehow different now, sent a wave of conflicting emotions through me. Anger at his audacity, grief for what we'd lost, confusion about how the man I'd loved could speak so coldly about taking our life savings. Judge Hammond's expression revealed nothing. Mr. Davidson, do you have documentation regarding these alleged business expenses? We're gathering those records, Your Honor. However, I'd like to note that in a no-fault divorce state, the reasons for marital dissolution aren't relevant to the division of assets. I'm well aware of state law, Counselor, Judge Hammond replied, dryly. But financial misconduct absolutely falls within this court's purview, regardless of fault grounds for the divorce itself. I glanced at Elaine, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod of approval. The judge was already seeing through David's attempted deflection. Ms. Baxter, you've requested a temporary freeze on remaining marital assets and the return of a portion of the withdrawn funds. On what basis? Elaine rose. Your Honor, we have documented evidence that Mr. Winters has been planning this departure for some time, in coordination with a third party with whom he has been romantically involved. The withdrawal of funds was not an equitable division, but a calculated attempt to remove assets before filing for divorce. She presented the court with copies of the evidence we'd gathered, bank statements, credit card records, the expense reports Marshall had provided, even photographs of the notebook entries I'd discovered. Furthermore, Elaine continued, Mr. Winters has violated the temporary restraining order issued yesterday by contacting my client directly and attempting to arrange a meeting outside of legal channels. She submitted a printout of David's text message. Judge Hammond reviewed it, her expression hardening slightly. Mr. Winters, she said, looking directly at David, are you aware that violating a restraining order is a serious matter? David shifted uncomfortably. I was simply trying to resolve this situation amicably, Your Honor. The legal process seemed unnecessary given our history. The legal process, as you call it, exists precisely to protect both parties in situations like this, Judge Hammond replied. Ms. Baxter, continue. For the next 30 minutes, Elaine methodically presented our case, outlining not just the financial withdrawals, but the pattern of deception leading up to them. David's attorney attempted to characterize the situation as a simple marital breakdown where both parties were entitled to equitable division, but the evidence of premeditation was difficult to dismiss. When it was my turn to speak, I focused on facts rather than emotions. My contributions to the joint account, the mortgage I was now solely responsible for, the credit card debt David had incurred in both our names. Your Honor, I concluded, I'm not seeking to punish my husband for ending our marriage. I'm simply asking for the return of funds that rightfully belong to both of us, and protection from further financial harm while the divorce proceeds. Judge Hammond nodded, then turned to David. Mr. Winters, do Do you have anything to add before I rule? David looked directly at me for the first time since the hearing began. Caroline has always been excellent with numbers and details. It's one of the things I admired about her. But what her careful accounting doesn't show is the years I spent supporting her career, the clients I introduced her to, the professional connections I helped her establish. Marriage is more than bank deposits and withdrawals. It's an investment of time, energy, and opportunity. I believe I'm entitled to a return on that investment. The calculated coldness of his statement stunned me. This was the man who had promised to love me forever, now reducing our 8 years together to a business transaction from which he deserved to profit. Judge Hammond's expression remained impassive, but her tone sharpened. Mr. Winters, this court deals with the tangible assets of a marriage, not metaphorical investments. If you wish to make a case for specific contributions that should be factored into the final division, you and your attorney are welcome to present them at the appropriate time. She shuffled the papers before her, then looked up decisively. Having reviewed the evidence presented, I find sufficient cause for concern regarding the disposition of marital assets. Therefore, I am ordering the following temporary measures until a final settlement can be reached. First, Mr. Winters shall return $50,000 to a court-controlled escrow account within 72 hours. Second, all remaining joint accounts and credit cards are frozen effective immediately. Third, Mr. Winters shall continue to be bound by the existing restraining order, with the additional provision that all communication must go through counsel. Fourth, Mrs. Winters shall have exclusive use of the marital home during these proceedings, with Mr. Winters responsible for half of the mortgage payment as temporary support. These measures will remain in effect until either a settlement is reached or this court orders otherwise. We will reconvene in 60 days to assess progress toward resolution. She struck her gavel once. Next case. It happened so quickly. This momentous ruling that validated my claims and provided the first real consequences for David's actions. As we gathered our things to leave, I risked a glance at my husband. His face was flushed with anger, jaw clenched as he whispered furiously to his attorney. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Elaine allowed herself a small smile. That went even better than I expected. Judge Hammond clearly saw through David's attempts to justify his actions. What happens if he doesn't return the money as ordered? I asked. Then he'll be in contempt of court, which can result in fines, additional financial penalties, or even jail time in extreme cases. But my guess is he'll comply, at least partially. His attorney won't let him openly defy a court order. Megan joined us, practically vibrating with satisfaction. Did you see his face when the judge ordered him to pay back the money? Priceless. This is just the beginning, Elaine cautioned. The temporary orders give us leverage, but we still have a long way to go to reach a final settlement. As if on cue, Clark Davidson approached our group, his expression professionally neutral. Ms. Baxter, might I have a word? He asked, deliberately ignoring me and Megan. Elaine nodded. Of course. Caroline, wait for me by the elevators. I'll be right there. Megan and I moved away, watching as the two attorneys conversed in low tones at the end of the hallway. David was nowhere to be seen. What do you think they're talking about? Megan whispered. Probably trying to negotiate some compromise on the judge's orders, I guessed. David won't want to return that money if he can avoid it. After a few minutes, Elaine rejoined us, her expression revealing nothing. What did he want? I asked as we entered the elevator. To convey an offer, she replied, waiting until the doors closed before continuing. David is willing to return $30,000 immediately if you'll agree to drop the restraining order and negotiate directly, without attorneys. I snorted in disbelief. Is he serious? After everything he's done? That was essentially my response, though in more professional terms. Elaine checked her watch. I need to file the judge's orders right away. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss next steps? I agreed, and we parted ways in the courthouse lobby. Megan drove me home, chattering excitedly about the hearing and declaring it a total victory. But as the adrenaline of the morning wore off, I found myself feeling strangely hollow. Yes, I'd won this round. The judge had validated my claims and ordered David to return some of the money he'd taken. But nothing could restore the trust that had been shattered, the years I'd invested in a marriage that had apparently meant so little to my husband that he could discard it without a backward glance. As Megan pulled into my driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar luxury SUV parked at the curb. A woman leaned against it, sunglasses obscuring her eyes, arms crossed over an expensive-looking blazer. "Who's that?" Megan asked, slowing to a stop. I studied the woman. Tall, slender, perhaps early 30s, with glossy dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Even from a distance, everything about her screamed money and confidence. "I think," I said slowly, a cold certainty settling in. My stomach, "That's Sophia Reeves." Sucker, Chapter 4. Face to face. "You've got to be kidding me," Megan muttered. "She has the nerve to show up at your house? Today of all days?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I need to talk to her." "What? No, absolutely not. This is exactly what Elaine warned against. Direct contact outside of legal channels." Elaine said not to contact David. She never said anything about Sophia. It was a technicality, and we both knew it. But I couldn't pass up this opportunity to confront the woman who had been part of destroying my marriage. "Caroline, think about this. She could be recording everything. This could be a trap. Then, I'll be careful about what I say." I opened the car door. "You don't have to stay, Megan. This is my battle." "Are you kidding? I'm not going anywhere." She killed the engine and got out of the car with me. As we approached, Sophia removed her sunglasses, revealing sharp green eyes that assessed me coolly. Up close, she was even more intimidating. Flawlessly. Made up, not a hair out of place, wearing what was clearly a designer outfit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Caroline Winters?" she asked, her voice surprisingly soft but with an underlying steel. "That's right. And you must be Sophia Reeves." She inclined her head slightly. "I thought it was time we met." "Funny, I thought that time would have been before you started sleeping with my husband." Megan made a small noise of approval beside me, but Sophia's expression didn't change. "I understand your anger," she said. "But I'm not here to fight or apologize. I'm here to propose a solution that works for everyone." "The court already proposed a solution this morning," I replied. "David returns $50,000 and stays away from me. Works great from my perspective." Sophia's mouth tightened, slightly. "That's a temporary measure that benefits no one in the long run. Legal battles are expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately destructive for all parties. I'm offering an alternative." Despite my better judgment, I was curious. "What kind of alternative?" "A clean break. One payment, no ongoing obligations, no protracted legal proceedings." She reached into her designer handbag and withdrew an envelope. "This contains a cashier's check for $100,000 made out to you. In exchange, you sign a settlement agreement releasing all claims against David, now and in the future." I stared at the envelope, but didn't take it. "You're trying to buy me off." "I'm trying to resolve an unfortunate situation efficiently. The amount exceeds what was in your joint account and covers the credit card debts as well. It's more than fair." "Fair?" I laughed bitterly. "My husband of 8 years emptied our savings, maxed out our credit cards, and ran off with another woman. There's no fair resolution to that." Sophia's composure wavered slightly. "Life is rarely fair, Caroline. But it goes on. David and I have a business venture that requires his full attention. These legal distractions are counterproductive for everyone." I studied Sophia's face, searching for any hint of remorse or empathy. There was none. Just cool calculation behind those expensive sunglasses she hadn't bothered to remove indoors. She spoke about my marriage, my life, as if it were merely an inconvenient business transaction to be settled. Counterproductive, I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. Is that what you call the devastation of someone's life? A distraction? She sighed, the slight flare of her nostrils betraying impatience. I didn't come here to debate semantics, Caroline. I came with a solution that benefits everyone. Benefits everyone? My voice was rising now, drawing glances from nearby tables. I lowered it to a harsh whisper. How exactly does this benefit me? Beyond the money, which doesn't begin to cover the emotional damage. It gives you freedom, Sophia said simply. Freedom to move on without months or years of painful legal proceedings. Freedom from being tied to David through court appearances and negotiations. A clean slate. The worst part was that a small voice inside me recognized the appeal of her offer. The thought of facing David in court, of having my personal life dissected by lawyers, of dragging out this humiliation for months. It exhausted me just imagining it. Why 100,000? I asked. Why not 50? Or 200? What? Calculation determined this was the price of my freedom? It covers your financial losses with a generous additional sum for inconvenience. Her clinical description of my shattered life made my skin crawl. It's also what David can manage, without compromising our business launch. Your business launch, I repeated slowly. The one you're funding with money that includes my inheritance that I put into our joint savings. The inheritance from my grandmother that was meant to eventually be a down payment on our home. A flicker of something, discomfort perhaps, crossed. Her face before the mask slipped back into place. The provenance of the funds isn't relevant to our current discussion. This settlement resolves all financial matters. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly feeling a strange calm descend over me. You know what's interesting, Sophia? You keep saying our business and our launch. David told you about my inheritance, obviously. What else did he tell you? She shifted slightly. I don't see how that's... Did he mention that before we met he had 2 failed startups and a bankruptcy? Did he tell you about his pattern of grand ideas that never quite materialize? Or about his habit of blaming partners when things go south? Her expression remained impassive, but I caught the slight tightening of her grip on her handbag. I see he presented himself as a successful entrepreneur temporarily down on his luck, I continued. That's his specialty. He's incredibly convincing. I know that better than anyone. Tell me, what's this brilliant business venture that required stealing from his wife to finance? It's a tech platform that connects luxury property owners with high-end travelers seeking authentic local experiences, she replied, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. It's innovative and disruptive. I couldn't help the laugh that escaped me. Let me guess, he needs significant upfront capital, but the returns will be extraordinary within 18 months. Her silence was answer enough. That was the exact pitch for his last 2 ventures, I said, a strange mix of vindication and pity washing over me. Right down to the 18-month timeline. Did he also tell you he has industry contacts ready to invest once you show initial success? Our business model has been thoroughly vetted, she insisted, but I could see doubt flickering behind her confident facade. I'm sure it has, I said gently, just like our marriage vows were thoroughly meant when he spoke them. Sophia, you're not the first woman David has charmed with his vision and promises. You're just the first with enough money to fund them yourself. She stood abruptly, smoothing her immaculate dress. I didn't come here to discuss business strategies. The offer stands for 48 hours. After that, we proceed with traditional divorce proceedings. I looked at the envelope she'd left on the table. $100,000. A fraction of what David had taken, but more than I might recover through lengthy legal battles. A pragmatic solution to an emotional catastrophe. I'll consider it, I said finally. But I want 72 hours, not 48, and I'll be consulting my attorney. Fine, she conceded. 3 days. The contact information for our lawyer is in the envelope. Your attorney can reach out with your decision." As she turned to leave, I called after her. "Sophia?" She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Whatever you decide about David, I hope you protect yourself better than I did." Something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, of our shared vulnerability to the same man, before her mask of composure returned. "Goodbye, Caroline." After she left, I sat alone in the cafe, staring at the envelope that contained both an escape and a surrender. The practical side of me saw the merits of her offer: a painful chapter closed quickly, money to help rebuild, freedom from ongoing legal entanglements with David. But another part of me rebelled at the idea of letting him walk away so easily, of placing a monetary value on the betrayal and humiliation I'd endured. This wasn't just about finances. It was about justice, accountability, and my own self-respect. I picked up the envelope and slipped it into my bag, then paid for my untouched coffee. The decision didn't need to be made immediately. I had 72 hours to weigh the practical against the principled, the expedient against the righteous. As I stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight, I felt something unexpected. A small spark of gratitude toward Sophia. Not for her offer, but for unwittingly revealing David's unchanging nature. He hadn't left me because I was lacking, or because she was special. He'd left because it was who he was. A man always chasing the next opportunity, the next woman, the next reinvention of himself. For the first time since he'd walked out, I felt the faintest stirring of something that felt like freedom. Whether I took the money or fought him through the courts, I was finally seeing with absolute clarity. And that, more than any settlement, felt like the beginning of moving forward. I pulled out my phone and called my attorney. The next 72 hours would determine how this chapter ended, but for the first time, I was certain that a new one would begin, one where I, not David, would be writing the terms. "Thomas Blackwood's office," I told my attorney's receptionist when she answered. "I need to speak with him as soon as possible." "He's in court until 4, Ms. Winters. I can schedule you for today," I insisted. "It's urgent. I'll wait. At his office if necessary." There was a brief pause. "He has a half-hour opening at 4:30. Will that work?" "I'll be there," I said, ending the call. The hours until my appointment stretched interminably. I wandered through a nearby park, the envelope in my bag feeling like it was burning a hole through the leather. $100,000. A sum that would have seemed life-changing before my marriage, now reduced to an insulting gesture compared to what David had taken, financially and emotionally. By 4:15, I was sitting in Thomas Blackwood's waiting room, flipping through magazines, without registering a single word or image. At precisely 4:30, his door opened, and he ushered out a client before turning to me with a professional smile that didn't quite mask his curiosity. "Caroline, come in. This sounded urgent." Thomas was in his mid-50s, with silver-streaked, dark hair and the measured demeanor that came from decades of family law practice. I'd chosen him for his reputation for being tough but ethical, qualities I desperately needed in my corner. Once seated in his office, I placed the envelope on his desk. David's new partner approached me today with a settlement offer. His eyebrows rose slightly as he removed the documents and scanned them. Interesting approach. Bypassing counsel entirely is unusual and not particularly wise. Is it legal? Legal? Yes. Advisable? No. Parties are free to reach settlements directly, but doing so without legal guidance often leads to problems. He looked up from the papers. This is a complete waiver of all claims against David in perpetuity in exchange for this payment. $100,000, I confirmed, which doesn't come close to what he took. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying me. Based on our financial discovery efforts so far, your joint assets totaled approximately $270,000, not including retirement accounts. Your inheritance was $150,000 of that. He also accumulated roughly $30,000 in credit card debt before leaving. So he's offering less than half of what he took, I said flatly. Correct. Though their argument would be that you're avoiding legal fees and getting immediate payment rather than waiting through a court process. He tapped the paper thoughtfully. The question is, what do you want to do about it? I hesitated. That's what I'm here to figure out. Part of me wants to take the money and just be done with him. Another part wants to fight on principle. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. Both are valid responses. Let's examine each path. He picked up a legal pad and drew a line down the middle. Option 1. Accept the settlement. You get $100,000 immediately. No further legal fees, no court appearances, no prolonged connection to David. Clean break as they've positioned it. And option 2? We continue with the divorce proceedings. We have strong documentation of your inheritance being improperly removed from joint accounts. We can subpoena records to trace where that money went. We'll request temporary support, given the financial hardship his actions have caused. He paused. But litigation is expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. Even with a strong case, there are no guarantees. I studied the notepad, weighing my options. What would you advise if I were your sister? He smiled slightly at the hypothetical. I'd tell my sister that no amount of money fully compensates for betrayal. The question is whether continuing the fight serves your healing or delays it. And if it's about the principle, about not letting him get away with it, then I'd remind her that principled stands come with practical costs, financial and emotional. I nodded, absorbing his words. What if there's a third option? Thomas looked intrigued. I'm listening. What if we counter? Not just for more money, but with terms that provide some accountability. He leaned forward, interest evident. What did you have in mind? The full amount he took, my inheritance plus half our savings, and a written acknowledgement of what he did. Not a public confession, but something for my records. I don't need him punished, but I do need him to admit what happened. Thomas considered this, drumming his fingers lightly on the desk. Financially, that's reasonable. You're entitled to at least that much. The acknowledgement is trickier. People rarely want to create documents admitting wrongdoing. But it's not impossible. No, not impossible. We could frame it as a factual accounting of financial transactions, rather than an admission of misconduct. He was warming to the idea. I suspect their urgency around this business venture might work in our favor. They want this resolved quickly. I felt a small surge of confidence, the first in months. Then that's what I want to pursue. A counteroffer that represents what I'm actually owed, not what they've decided I'm worth. Thomas nodded appreciatively. I like your thinking. Caroline, not capitulating, not dragging out a fight, but asserting your legitimate claims. He made some notes. I'll draft a response today. Will you be comfortable if negotiations extend beyond their 72-hour deadline? Yes, I said, surprising myself with my certainty. Their deadline is artificial. I won't be rushed into an inadequate settlement. Good. He closed his notepad. Now, there's something else we should discuss. This business venture they're launching. The luxury travel platform? Yes. Given that it's being funded at least partly with your inherited funds, we should consider whether you're entitled to an ownership interest. I hadn't considered this angle. You mean become David's business partner? Not necessarily active, but a silent partner with a financial stake. If the business succeeds, you would benefit. If it fails, which statistically is likely, you'd be insulated from losses beyond your initial investment, which has already been taken. The irony wasn't lost on me. So I'd have a financial claim on the very business he left me to pursue. Precisely, Thomas confirmed with a slight smile. Poetic justice has its place in divorce settlements. I considered the possibility. Having an ongoing connection to David through a business venture felt complicated, but the idea that he couldn't simply walk away from our marriage with my money to fund his new life with Sophia held undeniable appeal. Let's include that in the counter, I decided. A 20% stake in the business, given that my inheritance is funding a significant portion of the startup capital. Thomas made the note. I'll have the counteroffer ready for your review by tomorrow morning. In the meantime, don't engage with either of them if they contact you. Refer all communication to me. As I left his office, I felt a surprising lightness. For the first time since David's departure, I wasn't simply reacting to his actions. I was making deliberate choices about my own future, reasserting control over my narrative. The next morning, Thomas sent over the draft counteroffer. It was clear, firm, and remarkably free of emotional language. Exactly what I needed. I approved it with minor edits, and by noon, it was delivered to the contact information Sophia had provided. The response came faster than expected. By 3 p.m., Thomas called with an update. They've asked for a meeting tomorrow morning, all parties, and counsel present. That sounds promising, I said cautiously. It suggests they're taking our counter seriously, he agreed. Though I should prepare you, these meetings can be uncomfortable. You'll be face-to-face with David and his partner. The thought sent a wave of anxiety through me, but I pushed it down. I can handle it. What time? 10 a.m. at our offices. I insisted on neutral territory, not their attorney's space. I spent that evening preparing myself mentally for the encounter. It would be the first time I'd seen David since the day he'd announced he was leaving, a blindside I hadn't seen. Coming despite what, in retrospect, had been obvious signs, I selected my outfit carefully, a navy blue dress that was professional without being severe, paired with modest heels and the pearl earrings that had been a gift from my mother when I graduated college. Nothing flashy, nothing that suggested I was trying to impress or compete with Sophia, but polished enough to convey that I was moving forward, not breaking down. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind rehearsing various scenarios. David apologetic, David defiant, Sophia smug, Sophia conciliatory. By morning, I had prepared for every possibility except the one that actually occurred. Thomas's conference room was deliberately arranged with parties on opposite sides of the table. I arrived 15 minutes early, allowing me to be settled when they entered. Thomas sat beside me, reviewing our strategy in quiet tones. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened. David's attorney entered first, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s with an expensive haircut and commanding presence. David followed, looking simultaneously familiar and like a stranger. He'd grown a short beard, changed his hairstyle, was wearing clothes I'd never seen, physical manifestations of his reinvention. But it was who followed him that caught me off guard. Not Sophia, but a man I didn't recognize. Middle-aged, conservatively dressed, with the alert eyes of someone who calculated risks for a living. David avoided my gaze as they took their seats across from us. His attorney broke the silence. I'm Miranda Chen, representing Mr. Winters. This is Malcolm Reed, representing Vertical Axis Ventures, the investment firm with a controlling interest in the business venture referenced in your counteroffer. Thomas and I exchanged a glance. This was unexpected. I understood Ms. Sophia Ellis would be joining us, Thomas remarked neutrally. Miranda's expression revealed nothing. Ms. Ellis is no longer involved in this matter. Mr. Reed's firm has assumed the primary financial position in the business. I studied David's face, noting the tension around his eyes, the slight clench in his jaw. Something had changed since Sophia's cafe visit. I see, Thomas said smoothly. Welcome, Mr. Reed. For clarity, our counteroffer addressed funds improperly, removed from joint marital accounts, including Ms. Winters' inheritance, which we understand were directed toward this business venture. Malcolm Reed cleared his throat. Yes, that situation has been illuminated recently. Vertical Axis conducts thorough due diligence on all investments. When certain irregularities in the initial capitalization came to light, we restructured the arrangement. My eyes locked with David's for the first time. He quickly looked away, but not before I caught the mixture of embarrassment and resentment in his expression. The pieces fell into place. Sophia had discovered the truth, either through her own investigation or because Vertical Axis had uncovered it during their due diligence. David's history of failed ventures, his pattern of financial mismanagement, and his misappropriation of my inheritance had been exposed. Sophia had withdrawn, but this investment firm had seen enough potential in the business concept to take over, likely pushing David into a reduced role. Miranda Chen continued briskly. Our client is prepared to accept the financial terms of your counteroffer, with some modifications to the business interest portion. Rather than an ownership stake, we propose a revenue-sharing arrangement for a 5-year term, providing similar potential upside without the complications of partial ownership. Thomas turned to me, eyebrows raised in silent question. I gave a small nod. We're open to exploring that structure, he replied. And the acknowledgement of funds transfer that we requested. Miranda slid a document across the table. A full accounting of all marital assets, their disposition, and Mr. Winter's acknowledgement of the inheritance funds being utilized without proper authorization. As Thomas reviewed the document, I noticed David shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His grandiose exit from our marriage had not gone according to plan. Instead of triumphantly launching a business with his glamorous new partner, he was now answering to investors who knew his flaws and had likely restricted his authority. The meeting proceeded with technical discussions of payment timing, revenue-sharing percentages, and legal language. Throughout, David contributed little, letting his attorney speak for him while Mr. Reed occasionally clarified points about the business structure. It was as if he had become a secondary character in his own drama. When the substantive issues were resolved and only administrative details remained, I excused myself to use the restroom. As I returned down the hallway, I found David waiting, his expression uncertain. Caroline, he said quietly. I thought we should speak privately for a moment. I considered walking past him but decided to hear what he had to say. I'm listening. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I remembered well. I wanted to say, things didn't happen the way you probably think they did. Really? My tone was even, not bitter. How did they happen, David? Sophia wasn't why I left, he said, the words tumbling out. Our marriage had been struggling for a while. You were so focused on your career, always playing it safe. I felt suffocated by all that caution. I studied him, noting how even now he was rewriting history to cast himself as the wronged party. So, emptying our accounts and maxing out the credit cards, that was just you seeking freedom from my oppressive caution? He had the grace to look embarrassed. The financial part was wrong, I acknowledge that. But I did intend to make it a loan to pay it back once the business took off. A loan requires the lender's knowledge and consent, I pointed out. What you did was theft. That's a harsh word for a mistake between spouses. Is it? What would you call it? He sighed, leaning against the wall. I'd call it desperation. A last chance to prove I could succeed at something significant. I thought once the business was established, I could make everything right. For a moment, I glimpsed the David I had once loved, earnest, dreaming of making his mark on the world. But that glimpse only highlighted how thoroughly I'd misunderstood who he truly was. And Sophia? Was she just a convenient investor who happened to share your bed? His eyes flashed with brief anger before subsiding into resignation. It was complicated. She believed in the business concept and in me. Things developed from there. Until they didn't, I observed. What happened? Did she discover your financial history? The pattern of failed ventures? Or just that you'd taken your wife's inheritance? She overreacted, he muttered. Started making accusations, demanding additional safeguards. When Vertical Axis came in with a better offer but wanted to restructure everything, she backed out. Completely. I nodded, unsurprised. So now, instead of being the visionary CEO with a glamorous partner, you're what? A minority stakeholder answering to investors who know exactly who they're dealing with. His silence was confirmation enough. You know what's ironic, David? If you'd been honest, if you'd come to me with your business idea and asked for investment from my inheritance, I might have considered it. We could have discussed it as partners, weighing the risks together. You would have said no, he insisted. You always wanted that money for a house. Maybe. But you never gave me the chance to make that choice. I straightened, suddenly realizing I had nothing more to say to him. I hope your business succeeds, David, not for your sake, but because now I have a financial interest in it too. As I turned to walk away, he called after me. For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just about the money, about all of it. I paused, without turning back. I believe you are. But being sorry after the fact isn't the same as being trustworthy from the beginning. I returned to the conference room, composed and clear-headed. The remaining details were sorted quickly, and by noon we had an agreement in principle. Final documents would be prepared within days, and I would receive my settlement by the end of the month, along with the revenue-sharing agreement for the business. When the meeting concluded, I shook hands formally with everyone, including David, AI, brief professional contact that felt like the proper punctuation to end our marriage. As I left the building with Thomas, he gave me an approving nod. You handled that exceptionally well, Caroline, especially the unexpected change in circumstances. Thank you, I said, realizing I felt neither triumphant nor devastated, just relieved. What do you think happened with Sophia? Thomas shrugged slightly. Based on my experience, I'd guess she discovered something about David's financial history that made her reconsider both the investment and the relationship. People who make their money tend to be more cautious with it than those who inherit, or marry into it. And now he's answerable to actual professional investors, I noted. They won't be charmed into overlooking his flaws. Exactly. Which, ironically, improves your chances of seeing returns from the revenue-sharing arrangement. He smiled slightly. Sometimes justice works in roundabout ways. Later that afternoon, alone in the apartment I'd rented after selling our house, I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. This qualified, not as a celebration of the settlement exactly, but as an acknowledgement of a chapter closing. I poured a single glass and carried it to the small balcony overlooking the city. The financial resolution mattered, of course. It would help me rebuild. But what felt more significant was the emotional clarity I'd gained. Seeing David today, diminished, his grand plans reined in by the very business partners he'd sought to impress, had finally broken whatever lingering spell he'd held over me. Not because I took pleasure in his setbacks, but because I finally saw with complete clarity who he was. Not a villain, not a monster, but simply a man whose insecurities and ambitions would always outweigh his commitments. I sipped my wine, watching the sunset paint the city in amber light. For so long, I'd defined myself in relation to David, first as his wife, then as his victim. Now, finally, I was just Caroline again, author of my own story, navigating my own path forward. The settlement would arrive soon. The business might succeed or fail. David might find happiness or continue chasing it from one relationship and venture to the next, but none of those outcomes would define me anymore. I raised my glass to the horizon. To clean breaks, I murmured, of the kind money can't buy. In the weeks that followed, the settlement proceeded as agreed. The lump sum arrived in my account, and the formal revenue-sharing agreement was executed with surprisingly favorable terms. Perhaps Malcolm Reed's way of ensuring my cooperation rather than continued legal challenges to the business's funding source. I signed the final divorce papers with a steady hand, marking the official end of 8 years of marriage with a simple signature. Thomas advised me to invest most of the settlement conservatively, while keeping some liquid for immediate needs. Take time before making any major financial decisions, he cautioned. Divorce creates a temporary emotional economy where normal judgment can be compromised. I appreciated his wisdom. Though the settlement represented only a portion of what David had taken, it provided a foundation to rebuild upon. The first step was finding a more permanent place to live. My short-term apartment lease would end in 60 days. You could buy something modest, my friend Megan suggested over lunch. Use part of the settlement as a down payment. Start fresh. Not yet, I replied, surprising myself with my certainty. I'm not ready to be anchored to a mortgage or a specific location. Caroline Winters, considering life without a 5-year plan? She feigned shock, though her eyes held genuine curiosity. Who are you and what have you done with my risk-averse friend? I smiled, recognizing the truth in her teasing. Maybe David was right about one thing. I did always play it safe, but safe didn't protect me from having my life upended. So, what are you thinking instead? I'm considering a 1-year lease downtown. And possibly a sabbatical from the firm. The words materialized as I spoke them, an idea that had been forming subconsciously. Megan set down her fork. Seriously? You love your job? I do, I acknowledged, thinking of my position as senior architect at Morrison & Bailey, where I'd worked for the past decade. But I've been there 12 years without a significant break. I have 8 weeks of vacation accumulated that I've never taken because we were always saving for something. The house we never bought, the family we never started. What would you do with this time? I hesitated, still forming the answer myself. Travel, maybe. Not luxury resorts or guided tours, but real exploration. There's so much architecture I've studied but never experienced firsthand. The Caroline I know would need a more structured plan than travel, maybe, Megan observed. She was right. Even in seeking freedom, I gravitated toward organization. I'd start with 3 months in Europe, Italy, Spain, and France. Focus on historical preservation and adaptive reuse projects. Document everything. Then perhaps Asia, for another 3 months. Now that sounds like you, Megan smiled. Think the firm would approve a sabbatical? I've brought in 3 major clients this year and mentored 2 junior architects who are now handling projects independently. I've earned some goodwill. I took a sip of water. And if they say no, maybe that's valuable information too. Look, at you. Contemplating unemployment as a growth opportunity. Her expression softened. I'm proud of you, Caro. After everything that happened, you could have retreated into even safer choices. Instead, you're expanding. I'm trying, I admitted. It feels precarious sometimes, like I'm building without proper foundations, but also necessary. The conversation shifted to other topics, but the sabbatical idea continued to crystallize in my mind. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Diana Morrison, the firm's founding partner and my longtime mentor. Diana's corner office reflected her design philosophy: clean lines, strategic use of natural light, and carefully chosen statement pieces that revealed her global travels. At 62, she'd built one of the most respected architectural firms in the city while raising 3 children and maintaining a 40-year marriage that was the envy of many in our circle. Caroline, she greeted me warmly, gesturing to the seating area rather than the more formal desk arrangement. Thomas mentioned you've finalized everything. How are you holding up? I smiled at the reminder of how interconnected professional circles could be. Thomas Blackwood and Diana moved in the same social and business environments. Better than expected, I replied honestly, which is partly why I wanted to meet. I'm considering a professional sabbatical. If she was surprised, she didn't show it. Diana had mastered the professional poker face decades ago. Tell me what you're envisioning. I outlined my thoughts. 6 to 12 months away, focused on architectural. Study across Europe and Asia, with regular documentation that could potentially benefit the firm through articles, photographs, and new perspectives on international design approaches. You've clearly given this thought, she noted when I finished. Timing-wise, your major projects are either completed or could transition to Taylor and Nikhil with your oversight during the next month. Exactly, I confirmed. I wouldn't leave anything unresolved. Diana studied me, her architect's eyes assessing with practiced precision. This isn't just about architecture, is it? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? Caroline, I've known you since you were a promising graduate student. You're brilliant, dedicated, methodical. You've built your career the same way you approach your designs, with careful planning and attention to structural integrity. She leaned forward slightly. But life isn't a building. Sometimes the most important growth happens when we step away from our careful plans. I felt a surprising sting of tears and blinked them back. I need to recalibrate, I admitted. Everything I thought was solid turned out to be provisional, including my marriage. Diana nodded, understanding, in her eyes. After my second child, I took 6 months away from the firm. Everyone assumed it was for family reasons, but truthfully, I was questioning everything. My career choice, my creative direction, whether I was building something meaningful or just successful. This was news to me. Diana's trajectory had always seemed so deliberate, so unwavering. What did you discover? I asked. That the questions themselves were valuable, regardless of their answers. She smiled slightly. And that distance provides perspective impossible to achieve from within the daily grind. So you think the sabbatical is a good idea? I think it's necessary, she replied firmly. The firm will manage without you for a year. The question is whether you'll come back the same architect, the same person afterward. That's what I'm afraid of, I admitted. And what I'm hoping for, simultaneously. Diana laughed, a warm sound that filled the space between us. Well articulated. Write up a formal proposal, timeline, objectives, communication plan. The partners will approve it. And Caroline, she added as I stood to leave, document the journey, not just the architecture. You might be surprised what turns out to be structurally significant in retrospect. With Diana's support, everything moved quickly. The partners approved my sabbatical with the condition that I provide monthly visual and written documentation that the firm could potentially use in their newsletter and social media. I secured a 1-year lease on a small but elegant apartment downtown, allowing myself the luxury of professionally designed space as a launchpad for my travels. I spent evenings researching architectural sites beyond the obvious landmarks, identifying projects in adaptive reuse and historical preservation across Europe. I created detailed itineraries, then deliberately left gaps for spontaneous exploration, a balance between my natural planning tendencies and my nascent desire for serendipity. 3 weeks before my scheduled departure for Rome, I received an unexpected email from Malcolm Reed at Vertical Axis Ventures, requesting a meeting. Curious, I agreed to coffee at a neutral location, a quiet cafe near the firm. Reed arrived precisely on time, dressed in the understated business casual of a man confident enough not to need obvious status symbols. He greeted me with a professional handshake and got straight to the point after we'd ordered. I wanted to update you personally on the business situation, he began. Out of respect for your financial interest, and because developments have been significant. I appreciate that, I replied, maintaining the same professional tone. What's happening with Altitude Accommodations? I used the official name of David's luxury travel platform, which had launched in beta 2 months earlier. The concept remains sound, Reed said carefully. The execution, however, has required adjustments. We've brought in a new operations team and repositioned David's role to focus exclusively on creative direction rather than business management. I translated the corporate speak. David had been essentially demoted, his authority restricted after likely operational problems. I see, I replied neutrally. And how does this affect the revenue sharing agreement? It doesn't change the legal terms, Reed assured me, but I wanted to be transparent about a recent acquisition offer we've received. A larger hospitality platform is interested in purchasing Altitude's technology and customer base. If the partners approve this sale, your revenue sharing would convert to a one-time payment based on the acquisition value. This was unexpected. The business is being sold already? It just launched. Reed's expression remained neutral, but his eyes conveyed volumes. The technology and concept are valuable. The current organizational structure, less so. I understood the subtext. The business was failing under its current leadership, but the concept and early development were worth salvaging through acquisition. Would the payment be larger or smaller than projected revenue sharing over the 5-year term? Smaller in potential maximum, but guaranteed rather than speculative. Approximately $180,000 based on the current offer. I considered this carefully. The revenue sharing had always been uncertain, dependent on the business's success, which itself was partly dependent on David's abilities. A guaranteed payment eliminated that uncertainty. Does David support this acquisition? Reed hesitated fractionally. He's been resistant. He believes with more time, the original vision could be fully realized. The other partners, myself included, see the acquisition as the most prudent path forward. I nodded, understanding the dynamic. David would naturally oppose anything that diminished his role or altered his grand vision. The investors were cutting their losses while extracting value from the viable aspects of the business. I appreciate you bringing this to me directly, I said. I'll need to consult with my attorney, but my initial reaction is favorable toward the acquisition. The certainty has appeal. Relief flickered across Reed's face. Your support would be helpful, though not strictly necessary given the ownership structure. But I felt you deserved direct communication, given the unusual circumstances of your involvement. We discussed a few more details before concluding the meeting. As Reed left, he paused. If I may offer a personal observation, Ms. Winters, your professionalism throughout this situation has been remarkable. Many people would have approached this with understandable emotion rather than clear-headed assessment. The comment was unexpected but gratifying. Thank you. I've had practice recently separating emotions from necessary decisions. A valuable skill in any context, he noted. If you're ever considering opportunities in the corporate realm, Vertical Axis is always looking for people with that capacity. I thanked him for the implied compliment, though we both knew I wouldn't be leaving architecture for venture capital. Still, as I walked back to the office, I felt a curious sense of validation. A shrewd businessman had recognized my judgment and composure, qualities I'd sometimes doubted during the tumultuous months of my divorce. After consulting with Thomas, I formally supported the acquisition. 2 weeks later, the sale was finalized, and a payment of $182,000 was deposited into my account. A strange coda to my marriage, representing the business dream that had partly motivated David's departure, now transformed into capital for my own new beginning. The final piece fell into place 3 days before my scheduled flight to Rome. An email arrived from an unfamiliar address, sophia.ellisalisconsulting.com. Caroline. I debated whether to contact you, but ultimately felt it necessary. You deserve to know that I truly was unaware of the origin of the funds David used for our business venture when I approached you with the settlement offer. When I discovered the full situation, including his pattern of financial mismanagement, I ended both the business partnership and personal relationship. This doesn't excuse my role or the pain caused. I've reflected considerably on how quickly I accepted David's characterization of your marriage and his justifications for his actions. It was professionally and personally short-sighted. I understand you've reached a settlement that includes compensation from the business acquisition. I hope it provides some closure. Sophia Ellis. I read the message twice, unsure how to feel. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. Perhaps the most I could expect from someone who had clearly moved on to rebuild her own professional identity separate from David. After consideration, I composed a brief reply. Sophia. Thank you for the clarification. We were both misled in different ways. I hope we each find better paths forward. Caroline. Short, civil, final. I hit send and closed my laptop, feeling a chapter truly end. David, Sophia, the marriage, the betrayal, the business venture, all now belonged to the past. What remained was the future I was choosing to create. The evening before my departure, Megan and a few close friends gathered at my new apartment for a farewell dinner. As we shared wine and conversation, Megan raised her glass for a toast. To Caroline, who turned a devastating ending into a courageous beginning. May your sabbatical bring you to unexpected destinations, both geographical and personal. Later, alone in my apartment surrounded by packed luggage, I opened the leather-bound journal I'd purchased specifically for this journey. On the first page, I wrote, "This is not an escape. It's an exploration. Not a retreat, but an advance in a different direction. Whatever foundations were damaged can be rebuilt, not as replicas of what stood before, but as new structures informed by both the collapse and the clearing of the site." In architecture and in life, sometimes the most illuminating question isn't, how do we preserve what exists, but rather, what might we create in this space now that it's open? The next morning, I boarded a flight to Rome, the first destination, in what would become not just an architectural sabbatical, but a deliberate reconstruction of myself. The Italian sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of the Forum as I sketched the elegant proportions of the Temple of Saturn. Nearby, a group of architecture students listened attentively to their professor, their voices a melodic backdrop to my work. 6 months had passed since I'd left home. 6 months of cathedrals and piazzas, of modernist masterpieces and crumbling rural villas slowly being reclaimed by nature. "Beautiful line work," came a voice beside me, speaking Italian. I looked, up to see an older man with weathered features and intelligent eyes examining my sketch from a respectful distance. His silver hair caught the late afternoon light. "Grazie," I replied, my Italian now comfortable after months of immersion. "Are you an architect?" He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "For 50 years, now semi-retired. Paolo Ricci." He introduced himself with a slight bow. "Caroline Winters," I responded, shaking his offered hand. "American?" he asked, switching to lightly accented English. "Yes, from Chicago." "Ah, Chicago, a cathedral of modern architecture. Are you here on holiday?" "A sabbatical," I explained. "I'm documenting adaptive reuse projects across Europe, learning how different cultures integrate historical structures into contemporary life." His eyes lit with interest. "A worthy study. Buildings, like people, must evolve or become irrelevant. Yet they must maintain their essential character through all transformations." The metaphor wasn't lost on me. "Sometimes the original structure must be partly dismantled before rebuilding can begin," I offered. "Precisely," Paolo exclaimed. "You understand the philosophy, not just the mechanics." He glanced at his watch. "I'm meeting colleagues for aperitivo to discuss a preservation project. Would you care to join us? Fresh perspectives are always valuable." In my former life, I might have declined, retreating to the safety of solitude and careful planning. But the Caroline who had spent 6 months following curiosity instead of caution smiled and said, "I'd like that very much." That evening marked a turning point, not because of romance, though Paolo would become a cherished mentor and friend, but because of connection. His colleagues, a diverse group of architects, historians, and urban planners, welcomed me into their circle with genuine interest in my sabbatical project. As the evening progressed, they invited me to visit their current project, a 16th-century monastery being transformed into a community art center while preserving its historical significance. What began as a casual aperitivo evolved into a 2-month collaboration, my sabbatical documentation expanding to include this unexpected opportunity to contribute to a living example of my research. On my final evening in Rome, Paolo hosted a dinner at his home overlooking the city. As we shared wine on his terrace, he asked the question I'd been considering myself. "Will you return to Chicago when your sabbatical ends, Caroline?" "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "But not the same as when I left." He nodded approvingly. The best journeys change us while confirming who we truly are. 3 months later, I stood in Diana Morrison's office, presenting not just the documentation from my sabbatical, but a proposal for a new division within the firm, one focused on adaptive reuse with an emphasis on community integration and sustainability. "Your sabbatical certainly yielded more than photographs," Diana observed, reviewing my detailed business plan. "This represents a significant expansion of our current approach." "The principles were always in our work," I explained. But seeing how other cultures approach the conversation between past and future clarified the methodology. The Ricci project in Rome demonstrated its commercial viability. Diana studied me with the same penetrating gaze I remembered from our pre-sabbatical conversation. "And you're certain you want to rebuild your career here? You've had offers elsewhere, I imagine." I had, including an unexpected one from Vertical Axis Ventures, where Malcolm Reed had been impressed by the documentation I'd published throughout my travels. "Chicago is my foundation," I replied simply. "I've learned that foundations can support entirely new structures while maintaining their essential integrity." She smiled, understanding the deeper meaning. "The partners will approve this. We'll need to discuss staffing, timeline, client development." "I've outlined those in Section 3, I interjected, my organizational instincts fully intact despite months of embracing spontaneity. Diana laughed. "Some things don't change, and shouldn't." She closed the proposal and met my eyes directly. "Welcome back, Caroline. Both the Caroline who left and the one who returned." 1 year to the day after finalizing my divorce, I stood on the balcony of my new condo, a converted loft in a historic building downtown that I'd purchased with the combined settlement money. Below me stretched the city I'd chosen to re-inhabit on my own terms. My phone buzzed with a text from Megan, confirming our dinner plans to celebrate the official launch of Morrison & Bailey's Adaptive Reuse Division under my direction. As I prepared to leave, I paused before the architectural drawing hanging in my entryway, a sketch of the Roman monastery project, signed by Paolo and the entire team. Beneath their signatures was a quote I'd discovered during my travels, from the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa. "Between a tree and a house, choose the tree. Between a house and a public space, choose the public space." I'd once built my life around the security of private spaces, careful boundaries that I believed would protect me from uncertainty and pain. What I'd learned, through both devastation and reconstruction, was that the richest architecture, of buildings and of lives, creates permeable boundaries between private and public, between preservation and innovation, between caution and courage. David had been wrong about me playing it too safe, yet right that I needed to expand beyond comfortable constraints. The irony that his betrayal had catalyzed exactly that expansion wasn't lost on me. According to a mutual friend, he was now working for a tourism startup in Miami, still chasing the next big opportunity, still reinventing himself with each setback. I felt no bitterness toward him now, only a distant compassion for someone constantly fleeing himself. The business that had been his exit strategy from our marriage had ultimately provided capital for my own transformation, a symmetry that occasionally made me smile. On my desk lay the leather journal I'd begun on the eve of my departure, its pages now filled with sketches, observations, and reflections from Rome to Barcelona, Paris to Prague, Tokyo to Kyoto. The final entry, written the night before returning, to Chicago, read: Architecture teaches us that endings and beginnings are artificial distinctions. What appears to be demolition is often the first step in construction. What seems like an endpoint is merely a threshold to a different space. The materials that once structured our past can be salvaged, reimagined, and incorporated into whatever we choose to build next. The most beautiful buildings acknowledge their history without being imprisoned by it. They carry forward what remains meaningful while creating new possibilities for light, movement, and connection. I am my own adaptive reuse project, honoring what came before while designing for what lies ahead. I closed the door behind me and stepped into the evening, moving forward into spaces of my own creation.